Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
So hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin. Today, I'm excited to get reacquainted with an old colleague, Dr. Carl Marci. Dr. Marci is a leader in the fields of social and consumer neuroscience and serves as the Chief Medical Officer at Cava Capital. Formerly the Chief Neuroscientist at the Nielsen Company, he's also on the faculty of Harvard Medical School. I've heard of that place. And is a psychiatrist at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Marci is also the author of Rewired, Protecting Your Brain in the Digital Age. And he joins me today to talk about his book and so much more. Welcome to Uncorking Story, Dr. Marci.
Mike, it's great to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. And Carl, I will ask you the same question I ask everybody who sits in, on the screen. I usually would say sits in the chair across from me, but we are doing this virtually. Carl, where does your story begin?
Yeah, I mean, as it relates to the book, it really begins about 10 years ago, where I was trying to make sense of the two halves of my professional career up to that point. So the first half, after I graduated medical school and did my residency training in adult psychiatry, I was an academic psychiatrist, and I was studying the neurobiology of empathy, particularly as it relates to psychotherapy. I became very enamored with psychotherapy as I was going through my training, because if you think about it, here is one person sitting with another once or twice a week at the most these days, and having outcomes that were as powerful as Prozac, right? No laying on of hands, no pill, no surgical intervention, yet people were getting better. And we really didn't have a clue how that was happening. So having trained at a time when neuroimaging was just coming of age, and we all grew up with brains on the cover of Time magazine, and I became very enthralled by the neurosciences. I thought, wouldn't this be kind of cool to research, and how could we do it? And so I was literally going around the hospital wiring up patients and clinicians and measuring their physiologic responses as they were doing therapy. My big idea was that it wasn't about one person, it was a dyad. It's about one brain understanding the other. And the other nice thing about psychotherapy is it's pretty much a one-way track. It's the therapist really trying to understand the patient, not the other way around. So I was doing all that and having some fun, and along the way, someone said I should go over to the MIT Media Lab, and they were essentially building the first generation of what we now call wearable devices. So they were taking handheld computers and putting sensors in them and measuring heart rate, and they had Bluetooth sensors and voice activators, and then literally wiring it into a vest and walking around. I was like, oh my gosh, you have a multi-sensing wearable computer platform. That's amazing. What are you doing with it? And they're like, we're not sure what to do with it. I said, well, I have some ideas. And then that led me to an entrepreneurial path. And you and I met when I was doing Interscope, which was later bought by Nielsen, which was a pioneer in consumer neuroscience. So the application of neuroscience tools and principles to media marketing questions. And those two things didn't really make sense at some level, empathy and media marketing. And sometimes I would say, oh, well, maybe we're understanding consumers' empathy with products, right? But it fell flat.
It's a little stretch. It's a stretch.
It's a bit of a stretch, right? Well, then one day, and I tell this story in the book, I was in the Time Warner Media Center and lab, and we were doing a study. This is around 2011. And it was for Turner Broadcasting. And we had randomized young women, so 18 to 21, who were heavy users of social media. And they brought their smartphones with them. And they were getting paid $150 to watch TV. And we were tracking their eye movements and some other behavioral things. And it was all captured on closed circuit TV. And I was sitting in this room because there was some, the client was there. And we had randomized these young women into one of two conditions. Basically, watch like you would at home with your smartphone. And the other condition, like, oh, we're going to take your phone away for an hour, just watch, without it. And we didn't realize that is essentially an early deprivation study.
Yeah.
So we're taking away this thing that these young women had a very powerful attachment to. And I'm sitting there watching the first one, and who doesn't have her phone, and she's sort of fidgeting, right? She's sort of bouncing around. I was like, she doesn't look very good. I was like, is she having a panic attack? She anxious? Occasionally people would show up doing drugs or high on something. And I was like, I think I turned to the executive and said, I don't think she's going to make it. And less than 10 minutes in, she gets up, bolts out of the room, grabs her phone, and leaves without payment. I was like, huh. So I go out and is there any unusual activity before, the session? No. Nothing strange. No. Next young woman comes into that same group, same thing. Next one, same thing. We lost a third of these young women, and the other group, 100% of them finished.
Yeah, and
got paid. And all I could think of was college undergraduate psychology classes and Skinner boxes. Remember the
yeah,
right? Remember those
absolutely.
studies that they put the rat or the mouse in the box, and they give them water, and then it turns into cocaine, and they start licking the cocaine instead of the water, and then you take away the cocaine, and they start going in circles and having withdrawal.
Yeah,
and
it's
it was
like
that moment.
the issue with dopamine, right?
That's right. So they get hooked. They get their brains get hooked. The dopamine gets released. It becomes rewarding. They develop the habit, which turns into an addiction. You take away the addicting thing, in this case, cocaine for rats, smartphones for young women, and they show signs of withdrawal. And it's physical signs, right? Heart rate goes up. They start to get agitated, and they very powerfully want to go and get more. And that was the first moment where I was like, whoa, this is not a habit. This looked to me like addiction. And maybe this was something that I could take my psychiatry lens and apply to media marketing. And maybe there was a book there.
Yeah. And it sounds like you could be ruffling some feathers there though, right? So the people who are hiring you to do commercial kind of work, they may not be so into these findings of yours. Is that fair to say, or am I thinking about that incorrectly?
Well, it's a good point. I have since left the field, so I'm now a healthcare entrepreneur. And when I started writing the book, I was a senior executive at Nielsen, and I had to be very careful, right? Because the Facebooks and Googles and Twitters of the world were our clients. So if you read the book carefully, I don't, I said, look, first of all, I'm not against technology, and I'm not even against social media. What I'm against is us not having a digital literacy and teaching young people how to use these very powerful tools in a way that is proactive and helpful to society rather than reactive and destructive to society. And I think that's sort of where we are at a little bit today. But you'll see, I'm not openly against any one technology or company.
Well, it's like anything. Things in moderation are fine. But I see my kids. So my kids, I have 3 20-year-olds at home, and they grew up, they're part of this generation that grew up like with screens always around them. And they are always, whether it's TikTok, whether it's Snapchat, not so much Facebook, because,
right. That's for old people.
That's for the 49 plus crowd that I kind of fit into.
Yeah.
But they're always on it. And, it's like, how many likes did I get? Can you like this for me? I got to keep my streak going. Like there is this like little addictive behavior in there that, it is concerning to me, but I also look at my wife, who will sit on the couch and watch TV. And she always, like the women in your study, always has her phone in her hand, doesn't even know that she's not paying attention to the big screen in the room and that she's scrolling through social media until I call her out on it. And then she gets mad at me. But I'm like, what are we doing here? Or are we looking at, so-and-so's fake life on Facebook, or are we, watching SVU?
Well, and the television, as you know, historically was a technology that was a uniter. It brought people into one room. It brought people to watch a common set of news, a common entertainment. When I was in elementary school, I couldn't go to school on Friday if I hadn't watched Cheers, right? Because you'd be an outcast.
Yeah.
So look, no one is immune. And in the book, I talk about Detroit when the Model T was first introduced in 1908. And, Detroit became a test bed for this new technology, the automobile, at scale. And it was a disaster. People were getting killed. There were no rules to the road. Children were getting run over playing in the streets. Farmers were going crazy with these noisy things going through their cornfields. And it was terrible. And it took 10 years before the first stop sign was put in, and another 3 years before the stoplight was even invented. And then we go on this, 100-year journey or so, a bit more, where everything got better. Right? We got airbags, we got better lights, better signage, highway lights. Everything was towards safety, safety, safety. Until ironically 2016, when the death per mile in this country actually started to tick up for the first time in 40 years. And the all of the data concludes it's the use of this thing while driving that is literally killing people. Right. So, Houston, we have a problem, right? So we don't let kids drive a car until, they're 16 years old. They have to pass a test, right? They have to have a chaperone for the first several months, and they have to qualify for a license. And even then, there's a lot of rules you have to follow. Why are we giving them a supercomputer in their pocket, untethered, and with connection to the whole entire internet, without any guideposts or training or rules? That's my concern.
Yeah. So what do we do about it?
Well, I think, when I first started out doing this, sort of like you said, I was thinking that this book would be as much about awareness as it was about, solving the problem. So the first two sections of the book are about awareness. I don't feel like awareness is the issue now. Everywhere I go, they go right to what do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Right. So the final third of the book is dedicated to 10 recommendations that are scientifically and empirically supported to really do one thing, and that is to support the health of our brain and our in general and our prefrontal cortex in particular. So if you indulge me, we'll talk a little bit about the prefrontal cortex.
Oh, you know what? I was thinking about it this morning while I was in the shower. I was washing, the outside of my prefrontal cortex.
Right.
But yeah, let's get dirty with it.
So, the human brain, 60 to 80 billion neurons, each one making between 10 and 20,000 connections. It's thought to be one of the most complex entities in the known universe. And what's really cool is we all have one. And most
of us use it, but
occasionally we use it. And we could talk about whether as a society we're getting smarter or dumber, but, and I don't make a lot of guarantees in life, but I guarantee the brain your listeners start this podcast with and finish with, it's not the same brain. But key to the story and what if people take one bit of neuroanatomy away from them, and I really try to make the book very accessible for a common audience. I don't get into too much technical details, but the prefrontal cortex, as you pointed out, it's right behind our forehead and our eye sockets, and it is the largest and most interconnected part of the brain. It, although it is not an area that people think a lot about, it consumes a lot of calories. And there are evolutionary psychologists who believe it is the part of the brain that differentiates us from other hominids, right? So the reason why we killed off Neanderthals after we hung out and had sex with them for a while, is because we had a bigger prefrontal cortex, and that made us very social. Right. So the prefrontal cortex, among many things, I describe it in the book as the conductor in our personal symphonies. Really is what allows us to engage with the world. Right. I mean, you are when you're not doing podcasts, moderating and doing focus groups with real consumers, and you're talking to them and you're trying to engage them in a conversation. Right. And the three components of engagement are they have to pay attention. Right. You have to get them to emotionally respond to some portion of your question or the conversation for them to hold their attention. And then, you're going to ultimately get them to recall memories or lay down new memories that ultimately will change their behaviors. And that is a definition of engagement. And that's what the prefrontal cortex really helps us do and orchestrate. So imagine a world where the prefrontal cortex is under threat. Right. So I talk about the 3Ds, right? When we're distracted, divided, and depressed, that's sort of an understatement. But if we're, go in a world where, when you and I grew up, probably the average age of routine media consumption was 4 years. Now exposure is at 4 months and routine use is 9 months, so less than a year old. We know from Nielsen data, if you go back to 2002, the average American adult consumed, roughly 40 hours a week of media. It's a lot of media. Flash forward 20 years, it's double. How do we do 11, 12 hours a day consuming media? Well, there's two ways we do that. One, we have found time because we now have media in our pockets. It goes everywhere we go. And the second way, as you were talking about your wife, you're sitting there consuming two media devices at the same time, right? The TV's on and she's on her phone. She's media multitasking. And what do we know from the media tasking literature, right? We know two things over and over and over again. We find the same thing. Error rate goes up, processing speed goes down. But we all do it. Why? Well, it's a little brain trick, right? When we're doing two things at once, we are working harder. And typically when we work harder, we are more productive. But in this case, we're not, we're less. So you get into this world where the prefrontal cortex is mediating all of this stuff, where we know from brain imaging studies, when people are trying to do two things at once, the prefrontal cortex lights up harder because it becomes a bottleneck. It's trying to send too much information into too many channels, which is why we ultimately slow down and make mistakes. So the recommendations are really around how do you protect your brain and how do you protect your prefrontal cortex? And they run the gamut from, number one, embrace monotasking over multitasking, particularly if you want to be productive. Right now, I'm not saying, folding the laundry and listening to music is going to hurt your prefrontal cortex. But if you're a kid and you're doing your homework and you have a social media app open, that's going to hurt your grades. And if you do that enough, you're actually going to, and we know this, you're going to have less gray and white matter in your brain. And you're going to have less connectivity between different parts of your brain. And that's going to impact not only your grades, it's going to impact your ability to function socially. And the big, I think one of the big ideas in the book is that this is going to contribute in significant ways to what we're already seeing, which is an epidemic of mental illness in adolescence, right? Everything from ADHD to depression to anxiety, tragically suicide are going up, double-digit rates in a way that's overwhelming our system. And I think, all this media consumption is playing a role.
Yeah. No, I had a plot point in one of my books about sort of addictive behavior around social media and how it could lead to increased anxiety and depression in some kids. And so that's something that's been sort of on my mind, and more so than just as a plot point. I mean, also as a dad, just seeing my kids, and now thankfully they're all well adjusted. They all do very well in college, but I worried. I mean, absolutely. My son would do homework all night long with his friend Ava on FaceTime, like all night. And he'd be talking to her and then he'd be doing homework and then they'd be doing whatever else they're doing on social media. And on one hand, I'm like, gosh, he could really multitask. I could never do that when I was his age. Then I'm thinking to myself, how the hell is he doing that? Like, right. He shouldn't be able to do that. That's not like a superpower, he should have.
Well, let's talk about that. And then let's talk about social media, right? So in terms of multitasking, again, right, we just know, and one of my favorite studies goes back, 10 years. And the authors of the study were convinced that a population of kids who grew up multitasking, they must be good at something, right? That involves multitasking. So they gave them all these different multitasks and they were terrible. They're like, they failed at everything. And it's just like this assumption that if you do it your entire life, right? Just because there's so many things, if you do your entire life, you get better at. This is just one of them that we really don't excel at. So imagine a world where, let's say your son, look, you're a bright guy. I'm sure your kids are very bright, but knock off 10 IQ points. Okay, fine, right? They'll survive. They'll get through college. They're gonna live a decent life. But do that across an entire population, right? And certainly do that, for that average kid who now is a little bit below average, or the below average kid who's even more below average. Factor in data that's pretty compelling that at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale, these kids are even more vulnerable because parents are using media as a babysitter because they can't afford childcare, and then adverse life events and other things. The brain just can't handle it, and you end up with the epidemic we have now. In terms of social media itself, we now know from people leaving Facebook, right, who famously talked to journalists at the Wall Street Journal, that there was internal data showing that, in particular, young women were vulnerable to eating disorders and other bad things, and that I don't think should surprise anybody. A company that large with that many users, there's going to be issues. I think that what I try to talk about in the book, and I try to tell people about, is like, look, for a segment of the population, the exchanging news and information to people who are a long distance away, who you already have a really good connection with, is a great idea. And in fact, there's some data showing if you use it in a particular way, it actually helps with self-esteem and makes you feel better in the moment. But what I remind people is, if you think about social media as a platform, right, the promise of sharing information and connecting with other people should be one of the best things for creatures who are social by nature and whose prefrontal cortex has evolved to allow us to connect to people. But the one thing that I point out is that you look at all the data on social media, the one consistent finding is it does not increase well-being. In fact, most studies show that it decreases it somewhat, and that's controversial. So most of the controversy is like, does it make us depressed? Does it decrease our well-being? I'm like, yeah, we can split hairs on that and we can talk about that, but no one talks about the fact that it does not increase well-being. It does, but why? So why are we doing it? Why are we spending so much time on this thing? Well, it's because what you said earlier, right? You're sitting there, and we know from neuroimaging studies that kids get a little dopamine hit when they see a lot of likes, number one. And number two, when they share information about themselves, right? And what does social media do? It gives you instant feedback, and you're constantly sharing about yourself. So, so I feel like we talk about the social media seesaw. On the one hand, it does some good things. On the other hand, be careful.
Well, I think the danger that I see, because I know many people in bad marriages who on social media will make it seem like, they are Ozzy and Harriet. Like, oh, my husband is the greatest thing since sliced bread. And meanwhile, I know, she's having an affair with, the pool guy. That's maybe a fictitious example. Maybe it's not. But I mean,
highly curated.
We see that happening. We see that happening. And it's like, I know that people are not living like authentic lives. Many people, not everybody, but authentic lives, whether it's through pictures on Instagram or Facebook and stuff like that. So then you're creating this like false expectations of what life is like, especially for teens seeing adults do this stuff. And they're like, oh my goodness, my life isn't like this. What's wrong with me? And maybe that's where like increased anxiety comes from. I'm not sure. I'm not an expert. No, it's kind of what I see.
It's a great example. So one of the recommendations in the book is to be careful about your self-identity, right? And so there's a field of psychology called social identity theory, which basically says, to quote Shakespeare, all the world is a stage and all the men and women are actors in it, right? And so there's this notion, and we're doing it right now. We have an audience right here, and you and I are putting forward a version of ourselves, a professional version of ourselves, as authors and thought leaders, and we're performing. And we're trying to be authentic with each other, but we're not going to tell our deep dark secrets on a recorded podcast, right? We save that for a select few of people who are in the backstage of our lives, right? And so this is theories that developed in the 50s that basically say, look, we're all constantly putting out a version of ourselves. Well, now imagine a world where you're growing up with social media, and not one social media platform, but 5, 6. I mean, how many do your kids use routinely? More than one, right? Sure. And they probably have a different version of themselves on each one of them. And then you're spending hours and hours a day curating that. Like where's the real you in that? Right. And Erik Erikson, the famous developmental psychologist, said about adolescence, there's only 2 questions that matter. Who am I and how do I fit in? And those are 2 really hard questions to answer when you're constantly presenting a version of yourself that's different every 5 minutes on a different platform, and then turning it off and not knowing, how to handle yourself, how to handle your emotions. I mean, look, one of the things I took away from some of the research we did at Interscope, where we were measuring people's physiologic responses as they consume media, in some cases in their real world, is that people, particularly when they're alone, use media as a mood regulator. Right. We get anxious and we just pick something up. I'll play a game, or I'm a fear of missing out. Right. I'm going to go and look on my feed and all these other things. And when it's an arm's reach away, why wouldn't we? Right. I worry about my kids who are younger than yours. Right. I've got my oldest is 9 and twins who are 6. And the stuff that comes out of their mouth. Right. The 9-year-old talks like a 13-year-old, and the 6-year-old talks like a 9-year-old. And we're pretty good at home, right? I mean, I literally wrote the book, but they're going to school with kids who maybe are watching a little more YouTube or doing other stuff, but they are exposed to so many influences today that it's hard to keep up. So, and all that gets amplified on social media. So social media amplifies the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah, and the other thing about it, I was thinking, I was learning a lot about boundaries last week at this retreat I went to out in wine country of all places, where we were not allowed to drink any wine.
That hurts.
Which is, a little painful when you can see vineyards all around you. And no, that's a dry event. But I was learning about boundaries, as part of like personal development stuff. And there are 5 boundaries they were teaching us. There's your inner boundary, which is you're kind of reserved for your higher power, if you believe in that sort of thing, because no human could be in your inner boundary because it's unconditional love. And then there's your goods, right? Your people who have your relationships with, close relationships. Usually your spouses are in there, but not your kids, because your kids are your semis. You don't want to be too open with them. And then you have your outers, which are acquaintances, or you have your acquaintances and then your outers, people who you don't have nothing to do with. But on social media, people treat everybody, because we do spill so much of our lives, personal details. We treat everybody as if they're in our good boundary, telling people strangers things that they should not know about us, that they shouldn't need to know about us.
Yep.
So it's also like, it's hard
sharing
to
intimate moments,
boundaries.
right?
Yeah.
Sharing intimate pictures and photographs. And like you said, also putting on a happy face that everything's got to be, the best time ever all the time. Right.
Right.
And it's not reality, and it's not sustainable. I think that's right.
So I need to know, when you were in med school, did you know you wanted to go into psychiatry and neuroscience, or was it were you open to other career paths?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I fell into psychology 101 as an undergrad. I was pre-med. I was in New York at Columbia University, and was on the track team, very busy, and was trying to think of what was I going to major in. And one of the seniors was like, "Oh, you should take Psych 101," and Columbia at the time had a very good psychology department, and I just fell in love with it, and I was like, "Oh, this is great." And then I was very fortunate to get a scholarship to Oxford, and studied more psychology, more experimental psychology, and philosophy of science, philosophy of mind. So there was a pretty good basis going into med school there. But when I entered medical school, I was thinking more like internal medicine, primary care, and I would think psychologically. Until we got to the neuro block in second year, and we started doing brain slicing, and I started looking at brain anatomy in a way that was so much more detailed and focused than anything I had done as an undergraduate. And I just fell in love with the brain. And when you're in love with the brain in med school, you have 3 choices, right? Everything's 3. You could be a neurosurgeon, a neurologist, or a psychiatrist, right? So neurosurgeons basically just do surgery, and they don't really talk to people. And I like to talk to people, so that's out. And then neurologists, what I learned, really only treat things they can see. And I was pretty sure there was stuff going on in the brain that we couldn't see. So that really left psychiatry. And what I also liked about psychiatry was that there were no 2 psychiatrists who really practiced the same way, because it's such a big field and you can go in so many different directions. And clearly I've had an atypical path, but you can, and all that circling around has landed me, where I'm sitting today at a company called OM1, which is a big healthcare data company that is literally using the same data science approaches that Google and Facebook use to sell us advertising. In this case now to try and work with healthcare data to get better outcomes, right? So we're imagining a world where you come in to see your physician and they put, Mike Carlin in and some parameters, and then it compares you to, 100,000 or 1,000,000 people like you and says, oh, Mike's going to do better with this treatment at this time, at this dose. And it saves time, money, and leads us to a better place. That's what technology should do in my mind. It should empower us and make us better.
Yeah, not manipulate us to buy a certain thing or think a certain way, which I think is even scarier.
Exactly.
Well, very cool. Well, I do have some fun questions for us.
Go for it.
Because this is always, I always like to say that Uncorking Story is about the story behind the story, which is your personal story. But so I want to get to know you a little bit more than I already do.
Sure.
First off is, what were some of your favorite TV shows when you were growing up?
Well, we already mentioned Cheers a moment ago, which, really was fantastic. I also was enamored by MASH. I loved Alan Alda and the characters in that story, and how, probably that's planted some seeds for medicine in my brain. Because this was back when they were reruns and I would watch, 2 back-to-back episodes every night after I did my homework. Those were some early influences. I'm also, will admit, cartoon-wise, I was a big fan of Scooby-Doo, and that show is still running, and my kids now watch the latest versions, and it's still good. It's amazing, and they've managed to modernize it. And the other one that has been wonderfully evolved are the Looney Tunes. I grew up Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Foghorn Leghorn, and they were all separate characters and separate, 10-minute shows. Now they all live in the same town and live next to each other and hang out. And it's so much fun to watch. Yeah.
I have to talk about MASH for a minute because my grandfather was a surgeon, field surgeon in World War II. And growing up, we used to watch, and he was a Fauci. I don't know if I should admit that or not, but actually we called him Fossey. That's the way we pronounced it as kids, not Fauci, but it's a consider him a great uncle to the Fauci. You either love or hate, depending on what side of the aisle you're on. But
yes,
we think he's all right.
Yeah. Well, I'm a fan.
My grandfather Peter, we used to watch MASH. He loved it, and he would laugh at it, and I would love to watch him laugh. But there was a depth to that show too. It wasn't.
It got very serious at times.
And whenever, I think it was the psychiatrist they would bring in, the guy with the
mustache. Oh yeah, he was great. Yeah, he was great.
Whenever he would come on, you knew it was going to be like a deep episode. Like some shit.
And he was good too. He was very insightful, and whoever did the background for him. Yeah. And again, I never thought about it till now. It could have been an early influence on me, right?
Yeah. But that was one of those shows where, for years it was, the most watched TV show, and then there's the Super Bowl, like the last episode of MASH.
It was 100 million viewers, right? Jeez.
And then we don't have that anymore because no one watches live TV anymore. So that group watching, that mass group watching where, you're showing up on Friday morning to talk about Cheers or Seinfeld or whatever other must-see TV there was back then. We don't do that anymore.
Well, I'll tell you, I was giving a talk this a couple of years ago, pre-pandemic, and it was in New York. It was an NYU undergraduate class that Betsy Frank actually was teaching, and she invited me to give a guest lecture. And we were talking, and I was talking about. I kept referencing in the early part of the talk cable television. And at the end in the Q&A, what's cable television? I was like, it's like, you're serious, right? I was like, does anyone know what broadcast television is? Blank stares, right? I was like, does anyone know what a television is? And there was a little bit of hesitancy, like, you mean the big screen on the wall? I was like, yeah, the big screen on the wall. I was like, oh my God. And I realized I had to literally describe scheduled appointment TV to these kids. I was like, when I was a kid, we got a TV guide in the mail, right? It was paper, and it was the schedule for the week. And we would study it to figure out when things were going to air because there was no internet. Right. And, when I was a little kid, there was only 3 channels. Sure. And I was just trying to describe how it's like, they're like, wait, so you could only watch, cartoons on Saturday mornings? Like, yep. Because there was no Nickelodeon, and that's what cable did. So we started with broadcast television, and there was only a handful of networks, and they had captivated audiences. And then cable came along and began to fragment those audiences into segments and catering to people's needs. And then the internet came along and put all that on steroids, as you know. So now, everybody can kind of, titillate themselves by themselves with any media they want. And this is why I talk about media as a mood regulator, right? So we would watch media, as a small family or group or even one-on-one, and then go talk about it, the next day at school or at the water cooler. Now, oh yeah, did you binge watch that thing? Yeah, it was pretty good. Oh, maybe I should watch it someday. And that's the sum total of the conversation.
Yeah.
It's sad.
It is sad. It is sad, but time marches on. For whom the bell tolls. So we talked about TV. What about music? Growing up, what did you like to listen to? Who are you listening to?
So I'm a bit of a progressive rock fan. Was heavily influenced by the British invasion. I had older brothers, so we grew up listening to Elton John and David Bowie and Genesis and Rolling Stones and things like that. And and I still enjoy that kind of music. I remember some years ago getting into the neuroscience of music and how it just lights up like your whole brain, and there's this like memory bump in adolescence as your brain is going through this rewiring that every adolescent does, and it's thought that music can play a really critical role developmentally in terms of your memories, and so people kind of get stuck. So you got to be careful what you listen to from sort of like 14 to 24, because that's what you're going to listen to the rest of your life.
It's interesting you say that. I had a teacher in high school, Mr. Roper, who used to play classical music whenever we'd have a test, and he studied psychology. I think he might have been a psychologist at one point in his life. But he would say, look, this music will trigger memories in your brain, and it'll help you do better on the exam, assuming you were paying attention in class. But my mother is going to turn 89 this summer. She has significant memory loss.
Sorry to hear that.
Very long. Her long-term memory is pretty good. Knows who everybody is, but doesn't remember what we're doing, on any given day. Like, she'll ask me, where are we going to dinner tonight? What do we do this afternoon? Like, her short term is shot. But I put her in a car. My father, his favorite station on Sirius XM is channel 69, which is Escape, and it is basically the Muzak channel.
Okay.
No lyrics, just melodies, and bad ones at that, or played badly. And my mother will start singing the lyrics to every song that comes on, even though she's not prompted by lyrics at all, because there are none. It's just the melodies that she hears. She knows everything. I mean, she could sit in front of a piano and play from memory.
She played growing up.
She played. Well, she was a virtuoso. I mean, she just played everything by ear. I mean, she knows how to read music, but you could hum her something and she'd be able to play it, and she can still do it. But it's that, like, music, I think, is, and I remember learning this in my psych courses, it's like one of the last things to go is like wherever your music memory is stored, it's intact for a long time.
It draws on a number of different areas of the brain, and it's also very powerfully emotive and emotional. It's interesting too. Like, we've all gotten used to this environment, right? With Zoom, where it's actually pretty amazing technology, right? We're having a really nice, authentic conversation here, and we're hundreds of miles apart. But there's a lot of information in audio channels, and if you think about music, with your eyes closed, you're visualizing, so you're using your visual cortex. You're listening, so you're obviously using your auditory cortex. You're drawing on memories if you've heard that song before, so you're using your memory centers. You're clearly having these emotional responses that are keeping you engaged, and you're paying attention, and you're co-creating in real time. That's a lot of brain power. So I'm not surprised that that's something that is preserved.
Yeah. Up next, thinking about the book. This is your first book, right?
Yes.
I'm sure you're well published in journals and such. But
yeah. First book.
So I'm curious, in what ways, if any, has writing this book been therapeutic for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. We were talking before we got on about, you don't write books to make money. They're really passion plays. And from a therapy perspective, I really got into the habit and began to crave, having an hour and a half or even 2 hours. I would get up at 4 a.m. before everybody else got up. And what I learned, which is germane to the recommendation of the book, is I couldn't look at my phone and I couldn't check email. If I just got coffee and went right to the word processor, right, and put my head down, I could have a productive morning. If I literally just picked this thing up and looked at one little thing, I would get distracted and couldn't be productive. So that was sort of like a parallel process, right? I'm writing about this thing and I'm having the experience like, wow, like monotasking is real. because, as you know, writing a book requires a tremendous amount of focus. There's a lot of references in this book, so I wanted everything to be, backed by solid science. So I was doing a ton of reading and making, going through the world's literature. And I learned another thing, which is I had lost the ability to do deep learning. And it took several months before I could, sit down and read through an entire journal article at a decent pace and take away the key points. I just literally couldn't focus. And I talk about this. I don't know if it made it into the final version of the book, but I wrote about how I was like, I literally got to the point where I was just skimming headlines and maybe reading a couple sentences of an abstract and making pretend I was like keeping up with the literature. Like, who are you kidding? Like you're not doing anything. So look, I'm fully aware of the irony that I write a book about how we all have shorter attention spans than ever. That requires a long attention span. So so far, I think maybe 3 people have read the whole thing. So I'm gonna have to do a lot of podcasts.
There you go. And kind of maybe along those lines, but what lessons about publishing do you feel like you learned the hard way?
I learned that publishing is in the last century. That while the rest of the world sort of moves forward and adopts new things, the publishing world, as far as I can tell, continues to use an old business model. So, as like, sure, I have a publicist, but she's publicizing 50 books, right? So I've got to do my own PR, I'm going to do my own marketing, and all that promotion, which is fine, but it's not, it wasn't in the contract, right? Like, hey, by the way, I think the other thing I learned is, editing matters. So I remember and these are for, tips for, I guess, future writers, right? So I remember the agent who was, like a friend of a friend, came down to Harvard University Press and this other, relatively new press that was offering more money and was clearly more savvy and sophisticated. And I said, what do you think? She said, you're a first-time author. You're trying to write a serious book. I would go with an academic press. You're going to get better editing. And at the end, you're going to have a better book. And I didn't really fully appreciate what that meant because I'd never written a book before until, we were going through the process. And, the senior editor was like, big picture, move this, get rid of that, cut more pages, change this. And then the line editor, the copy editor came in. And it was the most amazing experience of my writing career. I mean, he made me a better writer by orders of magnitude. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about the book because, he would pull things forward that I had kind of buried in the background. It's like, no, this is really important. And then he would kind of temper things that I thought were super important. And I'd read it a couple of times and like, oh, really? And then I was like, oh, actually, you're right. So I joke, people are like, wow, you're a really good writer. I'm like, no, I'm not. I had a really good editor.
That's true. Well, the editors need something to work with, right? They need something good to work with at first. So, you can pat yourself.
I give myself a little credit.
There you go. 2 more, and then we can wrap.
Sure.
How, if at all, do you feed your inner child?
That's a great question. I feed my inner child through my children and through play. And I really, I made a commitment, that was maybe part of the book and maybe part of just me trying to be a good parent that, when I'm with my kids, I'm 100% with them. And if I have to work, I'll be like, kids, I got to go work and go close the door. I didn't want them to get my divided attention. And the more I worked on the book, the more I realized that was probably a good idea. And then, so when I'm with them, I really try to mentalize with them and I really try to see the world through their eyes. And what's so great about kids, and everybody knows this, but they, everything's new and their reward centers just light up with such vividness to all kinds of things that we now just kind of take for granted. And, the problem with the reward system in our brains is that once it gets tuned into something at a high level, whether it's social media likes or video games or compulsive shopping or narcissistic posting, it begins to tune out other things, right? And so what we know about addiction, and one of the things I talk a lot about in the book is the difference between habit and addiction, is that it begins to narrow our world. And that actually creates a negative and vicious cycle downward. So I think, children in their perspective can remind all of us that there's a lot in the natural world that is rewarding, that can be rewarding and should be rewarding, because that's how we evolved to be where we are.
Yeah. And last one, if you could give words of advice, if we could Marty McFly here and go back in time and
Okay.
you could meet your younger self and give him some words of advice, what would you tell a younger Carl Marci?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would tell a younger me as I kind of navigate midlife that don't think you know yourself as well as you think you do, because you don't. And that, the process of discovery, like I'm a curious person. I'm very blessed that I've got a curious brain. So I love to learn new things. I'm enjoying this conversation. I'm going to think about your 5 layers of boundaries and being in Napa Valley sober and thinking about how to be a better you, right? That's fantastic, right? You're doing the work. But I think that discovery has to be pointed towards yourself and how we evolve, not only as we age through relationships, but also through technology, which is really, again, to take it back to the book, the book is all about what is our relationship with technology today. Guess what? It's a pretty negative view of that, but we're not done, right? I have no doubt that the human brain is resilient enough to navigate through the onslaught of change that's coming, and it's coming, and it's going to accelerate. It's not going to decelerate. What I hope for is that we can actually do more than survive, that we can actually thrive, right? That we can begin to, as we talked about earlier, use technology in service of our needs, not try to defend against technology who's trying to, really take advantage of us in certain ways. That's what I hope for.
Very good. Well, I think it's a great one to end on. The author, of course, is Dr. Carl Marci. We've been talking about his book, Rewired, Protecting Your Brain in the Digital Age. Dr. Marci, do you have a website? Do you have social media you want to share with everybody who may want to look up more information about you?
Yeah, I'm working on the website this weekend, but it's going to be rewiredthebook.com. I'm certainly on Amazon. I've got a page there. And it's easy to find me on LinkedIn. So I encourage people to take a look at the book and reach out with questions.
Very good. Dr. Carl Marci, fun conversation. Thank you very much for stopping by.
My pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.